On the 6th of December 1989, the Seventh Doctor and Ace strolled away into the distance. With a touching speech about the journey continuing, we panned up to the sky and the credits rolled for a final time. Little did we know this would be the way that Doctor Who would end. It was known that the show was going to be rested. After years of struggling viewership against Coronation Street, it hit an all-time low, opening season 26 with only 3.1 million viewers, and the decision was made to put the show on hiatus. The head of series, Peter Cregan, had long been looking for a producer to take over from John Nathan Turner, who had spent years in the role simply because they couldn't find a replacement.
We had really decided that this wasn't the programme that it had been, and that if it was ever to have any life again in the future, it needed a long rest. However, I felt very strongly that this was a programme that had been a great programme, a programme that could be still invaluable to the BBC.
The show had become seen as a bit of an embarrassment to the producers at the BBC at the time. While Cregan himself was apprehensive about the show, he respected it, and the hiatus was more in order to upgrade the show, to breathe new life into it.
Had there been somebody around who was absolutely passionate about the programme, a producer, a writer, who had got a vision of that programme that would actually bring it into a new sort of life, a new world, it could have been an option to actually push that forward at that stage. But I couldn't see anybody there that they were passionate to become involved with Doctor Who.
In 1990, the government passed the Broadcasting Act, which required that 25% of the BBC's output be made by third-party independent companies. With competition from high-budget American imports and this new mandate, passing Doctor Who over to a third party would have been ideal. Science fiction would stay at the BBC, if only in the form of the comedy series Red Dwarf, which showed that with developing technology, even on a small budget, decent effects could be achieved to compete with the Americans, largely due to new CGI technology. Doctor Who was cut off at the worst possible time in that regard. Special effects artist Mike Tucker was getting very ambitious at the time and proposed a new TARDIS interior with the console suspended from the ceiling. He also submitted a script for a potential season 28 called Illegal Alien. With Andrew Cartmel looking to move on to script editing casualty, likely to be replaced by Colin Brake, EastEnders script editor at the time, plans for the abandoned season 27 had only reached rough outlines of opening scenes. The season opener would have been Bad Destination, which would have opened with a large model shot of a spaceship where we zoom in and see Ace, captain on the bridge, who then goes back to her cabin to meet the Doctor and says, "I don't think this plan is going to work." Second would have been Thin Ice, a 60s underworld crime story written by Mark Platt featuring ice warriors. This would have been Ace's final story, with her having been built up by the Doctor over the past seasons into being worthy of entering the Gallifreyan Academy to become a Time Lord herself. This is the first possible Ace departure we'll be dealing with in this video. The third serial would have been Action at a Distance by Cartmel himself, which would have introduced us to a new cat burglar companion, who would have been related to the criminals in the previous story. The opening scene would have seen her at a fancy party going to a back room and cracking a safe, only to find a Doctor inside waiting for her. The final serial of the season would likely have been Elixion by Robin Mukherjee, who would have been the show's first non-white writer, that was submitted for season 26 but needed more work. This would likely have been the Seventh Doctor's final story after 4 seasons. Speaking to DWM a decade later, they would likely have been looking for a Richard Griffiths type for the 8th Doctor. Richard Griffiths, funny enough, had been in the film with Nail and I. That will come up again later. The first 3 of these stories were later adapted as audio plays by Big Finish, but without Ace's departure and the new companion being named Rain Creevy. The Doctor Who production office closed and John Nathan Turner tendered his resignation on the 31st of August 1990. As you could imagine, fans were livid, even if the media reporting wasn't anywhere near as strong as it had been in 1985. In fact, with its decline in viewership, many people hadn't even realised it had stopped.
Oh! Quick, Doctor, this way, danger! I don't like Sylvester McCoy.
On the 30th of November, the fandom held their Day of Action, where they did a mass phone into the BBC offices, bringing between 700 and 1,000 angry calls. While it was discouraged to be rude, there was some abuse, and this protest only made the higher-ups of the BBC angrier and killed any discussion of it returning that was happening at the time. Though the BBC still maintained that it was only on arrest, but would not return any sooner than 1992. You would think that would be the worst of it, but no. In 1991, a group of fans filed legal action to sue the BBC for failing in their duty to manage the property. Needless to say, this didn't go anywhere. However, the last vestige of Doctor Who on TV would come in 1990. A short-lived children's educational show, Search Out Science, did a Doctor Who special episode called Search Out Space. The episode had a sketch show feel about it, featuring the Doctor hosting a quiz show with Ace, K9 and a very eccentric guy, I guess he's an alien, called Cedric as contestants.
Good evening, sir. I've got a fair idea what the answer is. But I wonder if there's any way of finding out if I'm correct.
It had that goofy 90s CBBC air about it, of something that had just been put together to fill in the schedule, but at least it's a fun and educational piece, even if the questions are painfully obvious.
What makes summer hot and winter's cold?
So obviously, in the winter, it must be further away.
Perhaps in the winter the sun gives out less heat.
But possums, hear me out. In both those cases, the whole Earth would have winter at the same time.
It clearly wasn't made with the intention of fitting into the show's canon at all, and is more an example of the BBC reusing resources. It is rather an oddity in Doctor Who's history, though if you think this is odd, you have no idea what kind of stuff's ahead through the rest of this video. The first sign that Doctor Who was far from dead was the Doctor Who magazine. When a show goes off air, it's usually within 6 months that any associated publications fold, but not the Doctor Who magazine. Continuing to report on VHS or novel releases, fan events and conventions, interview with the people who worked on the show, and, of course, reporting on the possibility of a revival, the magazine never folded and is still in publication to this day, though its sales will probably have taken quite a hit. One feature the magazine had was the comics. Dating back to when the magazine was first published in 1979, the comics provided one form of continuation for the show, just like it had run in parallel through the 80s. The show had ended during the run of Nemesis of the Daleks, an iconic comic story that featured Absalom Dak, a conscript Dalek killer with his chainsword. One of the all-time most popular DWM comics, it was later followed by the sequel Emperor of the Daleks. A lot more eccentric than its TV counterpart, the comics made for fun short stories that filled the show's absence in this period, and even took on a flashier design for the TARDIS. There were two types of DWM comics, either one-part frivolous stories that are the definition of filler, such as the Doctor inventing conkers, or a big party full of past DWM comic characters where we meet Nick Briggs's Doctor from the audiovisual fan films described as being a future incarnation. But there are also the 3 to 6 multi-part adventures, often written by Andrew Cartmel or Dan Abnett. Some of the time these were sequels to old stories such as The Mark of Mandragora or Final Genesis, though there were also some moody stories like Fellow Travellers or Ravens. These were both written by Andrew Cartmel. One to note is Evening's Empire, that only published the first part before it went into production issues. It was later published in full in the autumn special. The comics would continue to feature the 7th Doctor, Ace and later Benny each month, until mid-1994, from which point it featured any Doctor at points in their past. While these comics were always aimed solely at fans, this is the point where you could say they weren't trying to be any sort of continuation. 7 and Ace would return in the most well-known of the comics from this era, Ground Zero by Scott Gray. In 1996, it was the final comic of this period and ended tragically with Ace dying in a Nitro 9 explosion to save the day. For years this was considered the only explanation for Ace's departure. Ace joined the ranks of Katarina, Sarah Kingdom and Adric as a deceased companion. One reason why the DWM comics may have dropped running in continuation of the main series was another popular feature in the magazine. Each month it featured a prologue preceding the next New Adventures novel. After Target Books were bought by Virgin Publishing, they realised there were only a few stories left to be novelised, mostly from the Seventh Doctor's era. The last Target novelisations, at least until One's arthritis issues were cleared in 2018, were the David Whittaker Dalek episodes, Power and Evil of the Daleks, in 1993. Both were noticeably longer than other Target novelisations and were done by John Peel. To make use of this new property, Virgin Publishing's fiction editor Peter Darvill-Evans managed to acquire the rights to publish original stories, continuing from where Survival left off and was pretty much the closest to an official continuation of the show that we got. In fact, many did consider them to be official and were able to slot them next to their Target novelisations. Of course, for the authors themselves, to be able to do this was sure to give them a tingling sensation.
Because I think I still had all my Targets in order in some bookshelf where I was living, and sort of placing it in order. That was a moment.
Of course, being novels, they didn't have to adhere to TV rules, and with the knowledge that they would tend to be read by older fans rather than the younger, they contained a lot more adult content. Sex, violence, horror, racism, alcohol, drugs, domestic abuse, gore, and swearing, with fuck eventually being replaced by cruck. For example, in Warlock, about a drug that plays on our human interconnectivity and enough of it can cause transference, when one character has his mind put into a dog, when he meets his pet, the first thing he does is have sex with her. The Also People has a passage describing Krish-Faye's sperm entering a robot. And there's a good chunk of The Man in the Velvet Mask dedicated to trying to convince Dodo to do a nude play. And for some fans this made the range rather off-putting.
Ace in my book goes off and has sex with someone and I was like, oh god, I've got to put that in. It's like you've ticked a box. Once I'd done all those those tropes that were I saw as being what were essential in a new adventure, I could then get on and write the story I really wanted to write.
But it was popular anyway. This fan-aimed range would also take the opportunity to explore the show's lore, becoming most well known for continuing the Cartmel master plan with The Other and Looms, but also delving into aspects such as Peladon history and the opening of Legacy, or mentioning the Human-Martian War and how old horror films used to depict the Ice Warriors as savages, much like old Western movies. An example of this is the prologue of Nightshade, which describes the Doctor's escape from Gallifrey, despite not being relevant to the rest of the story. The first novel was published in June 1991 and was written by John Peel, Time Worm Genesis. This told the story of Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamia, but with aliens. This really did try to prove itself as being an adult version of Doctor Who, with many descriptions of nudity and sexual activity that really crossed the line. Ace being repeatedly sexually harassed with little intervention from the Doctor, and the 13-year-old prostitute being one of the supporting characters. In fact, when we're first reintroduced to Ace, she's described as getting out of bed nude, the beginning of Ace's sexualisation. Suffice to say, this gave the media plenty to complain about. The second novel, Terrance Dicks's Time Worm Exodus, avoided that and was where the maturity was used better. Telling a bleak tale of post-war Britain where the Nazis won is almost educational about Nazi history and is presented in the easy-reading Dick style. Full of some brutal scenes in its depiction of Nazism, it set a high precedent for the range going forward and is one of the most popular. Then was Nigel Robinson's Time Worm Apocalypse, which was just a story about an idyllic society discovering their existence as a lie. Then was the first novel by Paul Cornell. Time Worm Revelation was a much more surrealist story, with a sentient church on the moon, and the Doctor and Ace spend most of the story dead, wandering around the horrors of their own personal hell. The Doctor faces a lot of his regrets and the personification of death, and discovers that that poster in Inferno was that universe's third Doctor. But it's more Ace's horrors that bring it out, expanding on what was touched on in Ghostlight. Her awful childhood can be symbolised by her racist school bully Chad Boyle, who wanders around in an Apollo spacesuit and is made to murder her in the playground with a brick in an alternative timeline. Suffice to say, ideas and quotes from this novel would appear again in the show.
Fear makes companions of us all.
Never cruel or cowardly.
It is in this hell that the Doctor is able to defeat the recurring villain of the quadrilogy, the Time Worm, a being who transcended physical form in the search for immortality, can possess people and pretty much becomes a god after getting access to the TARDIS. Another interesting point in this quadrilogy is the use of previous Doctors, both in the referential sense but also giving the feeling this would round off the show's canon, or it's more likely writers using the freedom they got in this new medium.
I might only get the chance to write one Doctor Who book, so I'm going to put everything in this one, everything!
The story after this is what would introduce what the VNAs are most known for. Mark Platt, who wrote Ghostlight, gives us an even more confusing story in Cat's Cradle Time's Crucible. The TARDIS malfunctions and the Doctor meets early Gallifreyan time travellers. In this we learn of early Gallifreyan history, that there were a succession of Pythias who ruled with their telepathic powers, but as the Gallifreyans lost this power, Rassilon rose up and overthrew her. But she cursed Gallifreyans to no longer have children. Now their only children come from the mysterious looms. Next was former script editor Andrew Cartmell's go. He showed his view of the Doctor as being the one in control in Cat's Cradle Warhead, which was for the most part the Doctor exploring this dystopian near future, the first of a trilogy of such stories along with Warlock and Warchild, where all the fears of the 90s, pollution and computers and disease and capitalism, have come. Meanwhile, Ace is travelling through a war-torn Middle East. It's only when it comes together at the end that we learn there's a billionaire who wants to convert humanity to computer programs, but it's the atmosphere of this dystopia that sells the book. Then was Cat's Cradle Witchmark by Andrew Hunt, where there's a gateway in northern Wales that leads to a land of witches and centaurs and unicorns that's dying out, and the locals are trying to cover it up. But of course their world is really a large unethical experiment. This was the last in the Cat's Cradle trilogy, which were connected by there being a cat in the TARDIS needing repaired. After this, the linking titles were dropped. Next was Nightshade, the first contribution by Mark Gatiss to Doctor Who. People in a town in Yorkshire in 1968 start seeing horrors from their past and then dying, as their energy is absorbed by a sentience living in a hill with a radio telescope on it. The title of this novel comes from the character Edward Trevithick, who played a TV character in the 50s called Professor Nightshade, clearly inspired by Quatermass, and thus he brings with him visions of these giant insect-like aliens from his show. The Doctor is written as much more cold and distant from Ace, with not as much warmth. He's thinking of retiring, and Ace falls in love with a boy called Robin. Visions of Susan spur the Doctor on more to not let her go, even though she asks to stay behind. In the end, he convinces her to come with him one last time to make sure that his plan has worked, but when they return, it's not 1968. The Doctor's not returning her to where she wanted, leaving Robin waiting for her for the rest of his life. It's a gut-wrenching scene of Seven at his worst, but he'd top it in the following novel. Love and War, which saw the return of Paul Cornell, is possibly the most iconic of the Virgin novels. It introduced us to new companion Bernice Summerfield, an archaeologist from the future who can put away a few pints and hook up with the odd alien, a character in fitting with the range. On the planet Heaven, where humans and Draconians bury their dead after the Dalek Wars, ancient enemies of the Time Lords, the strategic Houthis, plan their attack. Ace befriends a group of travellers and falls in love with Jan, a pacifist ex-soldier who was given human torch powers by the army. Meanwhile, the Doctor explores the archaeological digs and plans his moves. The Houthis are a fungus-like species that are infecting people. Anyone could be an agent in disguise. The Doctor defeats them by having Jan become one with them and activate his firepower to burn the Houthi. He hadn't thought how it could affect Ace, and sick of him, she leaves to go with the travellers.
Ace!
Leave me alone!
I can't! I won't!
Let go of me!
I just realised I was only half there, like in a dream. I had to be. They'd have understood me otherwise, read my mind. It's something I did to myself. Oh, I should have told you that. I could see Jan was infected that night at the campfire. I didn't expect you to.
You won't tell us then?
No, I'm a Time Lord. I don't.
You were!
I saved the lives of millions of people. Isn't one person?
What? You think that's a good deal? If you let go my wrist, I'll kill you now. You know that? You wanted me to leave him just because you told me to.
That may have. I mean, that might.
Leave me alone.
But it's me now again. I'm not.
Leave me alone.
Benny joins him, but already knows his true nature. With the 20th century being her favourite historical period, her archaeological training would come out best in Sanctuary, the only pure historical, where she falls in love with the atheist Guy de Carnac, who falls to the Spanish Inquisition, and Theatre of War, an intriguing mystery as an expedition excavate an ancient theatre that isn't quite right on the planet on the verge of war. This novel also introduced us to Irving Braxiatel, a philanthropist with a planet-sized archive of all the universe's historical relics and records. Despite only being in expanded media, she'd become the epitome of expanded media companions and is just as iconic as some of the main show companions. The Doctor Who magazine comics also adopted her, with her first comic appearance being Pure Blood, a Sontaran story with the original Sontarans before the genetic alterations, though we don't get to see much of her in the next novel. By legendary remembrance writer Ben Aronovich comes Transit, about a tube train system that connects the solar system. In the 1997 Doctor Who magazine poll, this novel was voted the worst of the V&As, and it is frankly incoherent. Aronovich's writing style isn't very descriptive, more being a showcase for futurist ideas such as technology or colloquialisms. It even has to have a glossary at the end, or people with names like Credit Card or Dogface. Its main theme being that evolution is a result of environment, so in a decadent environment, we ourselves become decadent. For the most part, it seems to be people doing things for reasons, and having read it, I cannot tell you why. There are clone Bennies who try to kill the Doctor and a presidential assassination and yeah. What it is distinct for is introducing Kadiatu Lethbridge-Stewart, the Brigadier's great-great-great-granddaughter, though I think most people remember it for the Doctor getting drunk. Also, it's full of sidetracks like this. But after that misstep is The Highest Science by the unfortunate Gareth Roberts. The Doctor and Benny trace the final journey of a disgraced explorer to the planet Scarrat to find the highest science, where they find themselves in a race with a group of humans, most notably the infamous psychopath Sheldaker and the warlike Chelonians, a turtle-like race that view others as parasites. They would return a few times throughout the Virgin novels. With fighting between the groups and within, there's also a kidnapped group of London tube commuters. It's a nice simple story and has some good humour throughout. Next was The Pit by Neil Penswick, which featured the Doctor meeting William Blake. While it contains lore about how the first Gallifreyan time experiments tore a hole in the universe that let in monsters, starting a 1,000-year war that the Time Lords have erased from their history, this one was voted the second lowest, and given we've already discussed the worst, I think we can say that the range tapers off at this point, with releases moving from every 2 months to monthly. There would be 61 VNAs in all, and Ace would return in the following novel, Deceit. Now a hardened Dalek killer after 3 years of combat, the novel began with Peter Davil-Evans asking if Ian Briggs and Sophie Aldred can forgive him. Notably, Ace now dons this skin-tight battlesuit and is a lot more sexually active with her new maturity, pushing into the sexualisation of the character, all while ignoring her implied bisexuality from the show. The Doctor would also get a makeover, now donning a cream suit and red tie. The range would become the Doctor, Benny and Ace for a while, with usually one being paired with the Doctor while another went on a side mission, more often Benny. Though there is Birthright, where the story is in thirds, one with Benny, one with Ace, and then the two together. Being split like this made the novel pacier and added a certain energy. Meanwhile, the Doctor was an iceberg, though he and the Cybermen don't really turn up until 3/4 in, with us just following a holiday journalist until then. Highlights from this period include Blood Heat, a story set in an alternate timeline where the Silurians took over after Doctor Who and the Silurians, and an aged unit are all that's left of humanity. Written by Jim Mortimer, much like his previous Lucifer Rising and later Parasite, is a very dense read but full of sci-fi ideas and descriptive concepts, and how the unit characters we know and love have been broken is brutal. This would start a tampered timeline saga, ending with Cornell's No Future, a unit story treated like a historical, with them teaming up with anarchists to stop a Vardan invasion, with the meddling monk pulling the strings to get power from a chronivore. It's nuts, but an intense, bloody and gripping story. Another highlight is Blood Harvest, with Terrance Dicks returning to his vampires from State of Decay. The story consists of 2 parts, with the Doctor and Ace in Prohibition Chicago dealing with Al Capone, while Benny's in E-Space dealing with vampires, which saw the return of Romana to Gallifrey, which led into goth opera. The novels that made the best use of the prose medium are Conundrum by Steve Lyons. Set in the land of fiction, it goes meta, with continuity errors being called out and a trippy ending, with the Doctor meeting John and Gillian from the old First Doctor comic strips, but them being facets of the land of fiction and the Doctor comedically dismissing them, and Ace discovering that she's a fictional character, seeing the novels she's been in and hearing a critique of her character. That said, the land of fiction characters we follow for the most part aren't very interesting. and All-Consuming Fire by Andy Lane, which is presented as a Sherlock Holmes novel written from the perspective of Dr. Watson, which makes it fun even if there's not much to the actual story. In late 1994 and going into 95, the range became weaker, likely with effort being diverted to the Missing Adventures range, with more lackluster efforts such as Strange England, St. Anthony's Fire, Falls the Shadow and Infinite Requiem. Parasite's also not very highly regarded, but I quite enjoyed the inverted story, set inside a hollow planet with zero gravity. The only notable event during this period is in First Frontier, which saw the Master regenerate to escape his cat-like form from survival, though he only appears in the latter half and the story's pretty much a runaround until then. That is until Ace finally departs in Set Piece by Kate Orman to fight with the Paris Commune after the trio was separated across time. This finally gave closure to her character after a more than 7-year tenure. Spending this story separated from the Doctor and Benny in ancient Egypt while they deal with Kadiatu, this managed to make her departure feel very natural and deserved. While she would have the odd return, this is the third Ace departure of this video. The range would pick up again in mid-1995, most notably with the impeccable fan favourite Human Nature. To escape an alien family called Orbitides, who want his regeneration ability in order to mass reproduce and take over the universe, the Doctor alters himself to become a human and erases his mind, becoming a school teacher called John Smith in 1914, acting against the strict punishment and societal expectations, though we still see the brutality of public school through a psychic boy called Tim, who at one point literally gets lynched by his classmates. Benny pretends to be his niece and hides the sphere with the Doctor's mind in it. Across the story we start to become deeply attached to John Smith, following him as he starts a romance with Joan, the science teacher. But when the Orbitides start taking the bodies of locals and start massacring people looking for the Doctor, turning the school into a war zone that literally gets nuked. Eventually John Smith has to make the ultimate sacrifice and becomes the Doctor to defeat the relentless aliens. It's a deeply touching story with his having to say goodbye to Joan and the life that he had built. At the end, in his mind, John Smith gets to talk with the Doctor and Death, and the Doctor says he hopes his future selves gain some of his humanity. It ends with the Doctor and Benny walking away from Tim's last Remembrance Day service in the snow. It's a beautiful and brutal story that isn't just the best of the VNAs, but one of the best Doctor Who stories, full stop. Also, the Doctor gets to keep the cat Wolseley, who becomes resident in the TARDIS. After this came Original Sin, a noir mystery set in the year 3000 that, while popular, pretty much just strings you along until the mystery is resolved and picks up towards the end. Though the aim of the novel is to introduce us to the adjudicators Ros Forrester and Chris Shrey, law enforcers from the 30th century. These characters weren't as popular and were, well, pretty bland. Ros, a hardened, strict policewoman who wants a suspect's ID in order to arrest him, and Chris, a younger, less experienced counterpart, her squire, who finds himself romantically entangled with a woman on almost every planet they land on. Of proud kosher heritage, it's notable that Ros marked the first companion of colour. It's amazing that it took until 1995. Following this, the TARDIS team consisted of the Doctor, Benny, Ros and Chris. There were some duller entries in this period, such as Zampa and Sleepy, with Sky Pirates being one of the worst entries in the range, with all of these asides feeling like it's trying to be Hitchhiker's Guide, but instead just making it hard to follow. Toy Soldiers and Head Games, a sequel to Conundrum, I quite liked, but the highlight of this period came in a trio of novels. The Also People by Ben Aronovich was again full of his futurist conceptualism that's a bit hard to understand, but he managed to refine it into an engaging murder mystery story set on a Dyson sphere with a super advanced sentient technology to the point that the Time Lords fear it. Though it still required a guide, this time to kosher pronunciations of names such as Amrista and Saragava. Shakedown, an adaptation of the Reeltime video I'll get onto later, written by Terence Dix. It adds a lot more to the story, adding context and how the Doctor is involved off screen, with only the middle section being the video production. It being a Dix, it's an enjoyable read, though the chapters that are an adaptation feel more bare bones and not quite as immersive prose as the novels usually are. Then was Just War, with the TARDIS crew navigating Nazi-occupied Guernsey as they tried to stop the development of a weapon that would change the course of history. Though this feels like a watered-down time worm exodus, it's still an engaging and brutal story, and notably doesn't have any monsters or aliens or villains behind the scenes. It turns out the Nazis developed the weapon after the Doctor happened to mention Owl's sonar to a scientist years earlier. The story Death and Diplomacy, a fairly dull novel but with an interesting B-plot where Benny meets Jason Kane, a 20th century human who was abducted as a child, think Peter Quill, ends with her and Jason getting engaged. This leads into happy endings. The 50th Virgin New Adventure and the last by Paul Cornell, they decided to market with Bernice Summerfield's departure. With contributions by 25 of the Ranger's writers, it saw the return of many characters from across the series. In fact, so many you could get a poster of the wedding photo, and references pretty much all of the 49 previous novels. It tied up what happened to a lot of characters, too many for me to list, but mostly it's just fun seeing all the old favourites back. There's not really a clear single story, but it's an assortment of shorts mixed together like a wedding day, such as an alien v human cricket game or the Master turning up thinking the Doctor's there after him. It's a fun story that was a good way to round off this milestone of the series and see off a fan favourite companion. It also coincidentally came out in May 1996, so is a good point to pause at. After this, it would be the Doctor, Roz and Chris going forward. One highlight of their run wasn't in the Virgin New Adventures, but rather the Virgin Missing Adventures, in a multi-Doctor story with the 5th Doctor, Cold Fusion by Lance Parkin. With the 7th Doctor not appearing much, spending most of the time in the background pulling the strings, after pretending to be an Australian stereotype who's married to Tegan, Chris gets paired with Nyssa, whilst Adric is paired with Roz, giving him some adjudicator armour. Meanwhile, the 5th Doctor and Tegan uncover what's so secret, an ancient half-dead Time Lord they call Patience. After some psychic links with the Doctor, it becomes clear she was banished from Gallifrey for having a natural-born child, not from a loom. But also contradictions from the show about the Doctor's age are highlighted.
Inside my mind, searching for secrets from cradle to grave. I have no cradle. I have no grave. I was born at others' tide through the loom of the House of Lungbarrow in southern Gallifrey, waiting to be born. Let me tell you, sir, that I am a scientist and I have been for several thousand years.
That's more. You left Gallifrey. Why?
I was bored. Bored? The Time Lords are an immensely civilized race. We can control our own environment. We can live forever, barring accidents.
The Time Lords allowed you to leave.
Have you ever thought what it is like to be wanderers in the 4th dimension, have you? To be exiles? Susan and I are cut off from our own planet without friends or protection. But one day, we shall get back. Yes, one day.
These accounts contradict one another.
Memories often do.
And it becomes clear they were once married.
You wear my husband's ring.
Yes, so I do.
The Doctor had a previous forgotten life in which he was married to Patience. In the end, she's killed by a corrupt adjudicator. The Virgin Missing Adventures were another range of original novels Virgin Publishing did alongside the New Adventures. They featured past Doctors and were designed to be inserted between existing TV episodes. The first was Goth Opera, a 5th Doctor story featuring vampires by Paul Cornell, published in July 1994, that continues on from Blood Harvest. The shortest of the novels and a fan favourite, Cornell hadn't quite polished off how to write these characters, and has said it wasn't his favourite writing experience. Though whilst it falls into simplicity for a vampire story, it's a distilled down enjoyable story. Frequent contributors included Christopher Bullis, David A. McKinty, but most prolifically, Gareth Roberts. While he has some unfortunate personal views that I'm not going to go into here, that will be in a later video, though fortunately that didn't appear in his novels very much. While his latter VNAs weren't great, Roberts was renowned for having a very Douglas Adams style of writing, and his contributions were very popular as a result.
Gareth Roberts, who wrote those terrific Tom Baker books, which really do feel like just packed extra length lots and lots of Tom Baker.
Having all of the top 4 of the 1997 poll of Missing Adventures, 3 of which were naturally 4th Doctor and Romana 2, as his work fitted best with season 17. For the most part, this range consisted of stories either not good enough for the New Adventures or that are trying to be like past eras of the show. Whilst not going into parody, it's difficult to capture these past eras and distinctive characters, and for the larger part wasn't as genuine, at some points feeling very exaggerated, such as in Invasion of the Cat People where Polly's repeatedly called a bimbo. Or in Burning Heart, with the newly regenerated 6th Doctor being overtly callous and rude. Whilst it's nice to have more of your favourite characters, these paled in comparison to the original stories. Though don't get me wrong, it was still a good range and had its good points. I already mentioned Robert's contributions, Romance of Crime, English Way of Death, The Plotters and The Well-Mannered War, but some personal favourites of mine included Change of State, Dancing the Code, Empire of Glass and The Sands of Time.
The Missing Adventures to me was proper Doctor Who. Doctor Who should be about monsters and fluffy things and maggots.
Where The Missing Adventures succeeded was where it filled in the gaps or expanded on original stories. Millennial Rights gave us a Sixth Doctor and Mel's story, a trippy sequel to The Web of Fear with Anne Travers that expanded on the lore of the Great Intelligence and hinted at the Doctor and Mel's first adventure as something to do with the Master. This blank period in the Sixth Doctor's timeline was also filled with an original companion, Grant Markham, only appearing twice and barely being in his first, Time of Your Life, which misdirected us into thinking someone else would become a companion who then died, and The Killing Ground, a story with time travellers going back to the Cyber Wars that learn firsthand what the Cybermen were like. This story just got the Cybermen right. There was The Dark Path, with the Second Doctor encountering the Master, going by the name Koshi, and only adopting the title of the Master at the end of the novel, but most notable was Scales of Injustice. Set after Season 7, it dealt with a resurgence of Silurians, but meanwhile Liz is feeling unsatisfied with her job, that she isn't living up to her academic reputation, and didn't belong in a military setting. Living alone with her guinea pig, she leaves to oversee diplomatic relations between humans and Silurians, giving her the departure that we never saw in the TV series. In the end, the Doctor can't bring himself to show his emotion at her leaving, playing with a caterpillar as she tries to say goodbye. All of these mentioned stories are the top of the range, while the low points included The Menagerie and The Man in the Velvet Mask. There are also some oddities in the VMAs, novelisations such as Downtime and The Ghosts of N-Space, the latter of which being voted the worst of the range in 1997, are also in there, and I'll be getting onto those stories later. But the biggest oddity is Who Killed Kennedy by David Bishop, which isn't listed alongside other VMAs. Clearly based on The Trial of the Assassins and its movie adaptation JFK, it's a Love and Monsters-esque story about a journalist called James Stevens who lives through the events of the unit era of the show and tries to expose their activities.
The Daily what? How did you get hold of this number?
It shows us another side to all of these classic stories, how they were covered up and the effects it had on people that we didn't see, such as a unit soldier who descends into PTSD and madness. In it, he meets and starts a relationship with Dodo, and we discover that after the events of the War Machines, she never fully recovered and was put into a mental asylum where she was subjected to electroshock therapy by the Master and sexually assaulted by another patient who she killed in self-defense. She then became homeless and in the end is murdered by the PTSD unit soldier brainwashed by the Master. Also, it turns out she had been pregnant. Yeah, I don't think David Bishop liked Dodo very much. In the end, James Stevens finds himself going back in time and having to be the one to shoot John F. Kennedy himself. The range would come to an end in April 1997 with the Well-Mannered War, with the Doctor and Romana meeting the Chelonians in the far future. Also, K9 ends up running for office. It ended on a cliffhanger of the Doctor and Romana being caught by the Black Guardian and escaping by banishing themselves into the time vortex. This never being resolved tells us that the range's end was fairly abrupt. One thing that's important to remember about the Virgin novels was that they did give a lot of writers their first writing credits, allowing them to start their careers. Some went on to be very successful and would continue to work and write for Doctor Who in the future. The likes of Russell T Davies, Mark Gatiss, Paul Cornell, Gareth Roberts, Gary Russell and Matt Jones, as well as expanded media contributors Steve Lyons, Jim Mortimer, Lance Parkin, Justin Richards, Andy Lane and Kate Allman. Allman, of course, would be the first recurring solo female writer in Doctor Who history, writing for 6 of these novels, starting with The Left-Handed Hummingbird, a trippy story set in Central America about a psychedelic alien seen only through drugs, though it does suffer from repeatedly referring to Indigenous Americans as Indians. She also wrote Set Piece and Sleepy, all 3 featuring pyramids, and later in the 90s would continue to write for the BBC Books range with her husband John Blum. Something you never realise is how much of an effect the VNAs would have on the show in the future. Davies would continue with his council estate setting, Cornell would adapt Human Nature into a TV episode, and many iconic quotes and scenes would be lifted into the episodes.
you know what they call me in the ancient legends of the Dalek homeworld? The oncoming storm. Attention!
And the more mature, thoughtful and conceptual forms of science fiction would be the direction the show would go in. The shape of Doctor Who today was formed in black and white text between 1991 and 1997. So while Doctor Who was being kept alive by Virgin Publishing, what were the BBC doing? The only department of the BBC that was still seeing the upside of the show was BBC Video, with sales averaging around 20,000 in the early 90s. After its discovery in Hong Kong in 1991, the VHS release of The Tomb of the Cybermen topped the charts, despite being released the same week as The Silence of the Lambs. Though the more recent 80s episodes weren't as popular as the older 60s and 70s episodes, as people had been able to record them on home videos. Having long wanted to move into producing soaps, John Nathan Turner was unable to find work after his reputation had been tarnished by his time on Doctor Who, so all he was able to produce were videos, starting with an extended cut of The Curse of Fenric. In June 1991, BBC Video released The Hartnell Years and The Troughton Years. Presented by Sylvester McCoy and John Pertwee, these videos were essentially the answer to the question of how to release the orphaned missing episodes on VHS.
The enemy of the world.
They each featured 3 orphan episodes from their eras, as well as clips, with interludes from McCoy and Pertwee talking about them and their eras.
It was after working together in The Three Doctors, very successfully I think, that Pat and I became tremendous friends.
This was followed a year later by The Pertwee Years, which was Pertwee similarly presenting 3 episodes from his own era, though of course not orphaned ones. The next videos were Daleks the Early Years and Cybermen the Early Years, both essentially being full 90-minute documentaries on each, or making their episodes in the 60s with a number of interviewees. But the big one was Shada.
Shada!
The missing scenes filled in by interludes with Tom Baker. This was the first time anyone was able to see what had been made of the incomplete serial, though Douglas Adams only signed off on making it by mistake, having not wanted to release his incomplete work. The release, essentially a brand new story with Tom Baker as the Doctor, was so popular the high-ups asked if they could make any other incomplete serials, obviously not understanding the concept. Later came the Tom Baker Years, which was basically Tom doing a 3-hour reaction video to clips from his era. The shorter Colin Baker Years was a similar idea, but scripted, showcasing a clip from each of his appearances, except Revelation of the Daleks, which Eric Sawer didn't want to give the license to.
Alas, we're not able to show you a clip from Revelation of the Daleks. For some reason, the author of that story has declined to give his consent, so I'm sorry we can't share it with you.
With him giving anecdotes in between. What's interesting about this video is how critical he is of the BBC management in it.
What an innocent word hiatus is. It means a brief pause, a kind of gap between exciting things happening. I still don't understand how any organisation decide, seemingly arbitrarily, that a product which attracts the kind of viewers, delight worldwide that Doctor Who has over nearly 30 years now, could be regarded as expendable. Anything that attracts regular audiences of 5 or 6 million people who really want to watch it, I think is certainly worth watching. And I remember being over in America shortly after this happened, and the head of a television organisation over there that bought the programme said to me very charmingly, Colin, when you go back to England, could you go and see Mr. Grade and say to him that we need more Doctor Who. We're not getting enough. Could we have 52 episodes a year? Something which earns more each year than it costs to make each year, which I'm reliably informed is the case. It does seem, not sound business sense, whatever else you may think about it, to curtail. We were told it was to rethink the programme. I'm not entirely sure that a lot of instructions were given to the production team as to how to rethink it. I think the reasons probably, though now obscured in the mist of time, are that it wasn't a decision which was entered into with any great thought. It was, right, there's a lot of old stuff, let's sweep it away. Oh dear, we have to justify it now. This is just my personal opinion, you understand, dear viewer.
And his confidence that the show would be back soon, despite this being produced in 1994, almost 5 years after the show was cancelled.
If and when the programme returns.
But what's most interesting is in the end there's an inclusion of a clip from The Stranger. With the popularity of their VHS sales, it wouldn't be long until BBC Enterprises would try to have their go. In 1993, Enterprises made plans to produce a 30th anniversary special. They commissioned a script written by Adrian Wigglesford called Lost in the Dark Dimension, or just The Dark Dimension. The story saw a creature from the future that they planned to be played by Rick Mayall interfering with the timelines, causing the Fourth Doctor not to regenerate at the Pharos Project so he can wipe out his later incarnations. However, the Seventh Doctor sent Ace back in time and, with her memory wiped, she works with the Brigadier, whose son she happens to be dating as they're both school teachers, in order to find the Fourth Doctor and help him defeat the Hawkthorne creature that has now made himself Prime Minister and plans to destroy the world with climate change, and not very subtle message. There are also the Eco Troops, played by Bernice Summerfield, who is not depicted at all like her character in the books. In the end, the Doctor has a sword fight with the creature and throws it into the time vortex, erasing it and therefore the timeline. And in this timeline, the Brigadier's son and Ace's lover, Alex, died as a child. While classic series director Graham Harper was all for the idea and thought it was the best action script he had ever read, he got a call from Colin Baker saying that there was no way any of them would do it. Him and John Pertwee, who would have appeared like a ghost in the void within the Doctor's mind, were not happy with their roles being merely cameos, with it essentially being a Fourth Doctor story. In fact, while they were referred to by their number, 3rd, 5th, 6th and 7th Doctors, 4 is simply referred to as the Doctor, so at this point it was already facing issues. Now, what you've got to bear in mind about BBC Enterprises is that they largely worked with video releases, producing documentaries such as the Years videos. The very idea of them moving into producing dramas didn't sit right with the higher-ups at the BBC, but who was all for it was the recently promoted controller of BBC One, Alan Yentob. Having been working to revive the show, he saw this as the perfect way to showcase the show's potential. He offered to show it on BBC One and even envisioned a limited cinema run. Of course, being on BBC One primetime would mean the production values would have had to have been much better, and it would have had to have been filmed on film rather than video. This pushed the estimated budget up to £2 million. With designs of the new Dark Dimension Cybermen and Daleks already drawn up, and location scouting already under wraps, the project was announced and they were 2 weeks away from filming, even though they couldn't get the Doctor actors to agree, when disaster fell. The money they were receiving from BBC One had been listed under both budget and revenue. The estimated profits fell to just £40,000, not enough for it to overcome potential unexpected costs. The project would be a loss. This just shows how unequipped BBC Enterprises were for drama production. A month after it was announced, the project was abandoned, though some say it was to the relief of some American influencers that weren't too keen on the project, not liking the script. There are definitely issues with the script. Hawkthorne just becomes Prime Minister in the middle, and there are random scenes such as a room full of dignitaries being massacred, and it's not very subtle with its environmentalist message. But who was Adrian Wigglesford, its writer? He got the job by claiming to be part of the writer's room at Pinewood. Such a room doesn't exist, and looking older, people hadn't realised that he was only 23. After the death of Stanley Kubrick in 1999, his assistants discovered quotes by him in TV Times that he had never made. These quotes were attributed to an Adrian Wigglesford. He was taken to court over the matter and was found to be a con artist, having sold many fake quotes and interviews to magazines and newspapers. In 2004, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison for stealing and selling 56,000 photos that he took from the Associated Press. In the end, The Dark Dimension is regarded as one of the legendary unmade Doctor Who episodes, along with the likes of Shada. Though whilst the concept of it sounds very interesting, we don't know how it could have been in execution, and if the script's anything to go by, not great. Hence it not having a Big Finish adaptation like other unmade stories. But something else was made in its place for the 30th anniversary. Dimensions in Time.
Madam, what year is this?
2013!
Produced by Children in Need, this 17-minute short was broadcast in 2 parts, on Children in Need and Noel's House Party in November 1993. As those programmes were so massively popular at the time, these episodes managed to pull in 13 million viewers, which meant 13 million people had to endure this.
Who's that terrible woman?
Well, I've seen them thrown out of the Vic, but never dragged in.
This way!
No!
Filmed in 3D, which I guess was a gimmick they tried to sell at the time, not that it worked. The camera is in constant motion with random bits of set dressing thrown about to make you see the effect. You didn't. It's also an example of the BBC reusing resources, as it's a crossover with EastEnders, which was also very popular at the time. You could say this makes the whole of EastEnders canon to Doctor Who, but there are characters in the 2013 scenes who were long dead in the show. The Rani is collecting one of all species in her carpeted TARDIS, and has already caught the first 2 Doctors.
Pickled in time, like gherkins in a jar.
Her plan is to, And she comes to Earth to get her final specimen, a human. But disruptions in the timelines cause the Doctor to manifest as his former selves, from earlier in his timeline, and Ace to become the Doctor's previous companions because, they didn't really think it out. At one point she becomes both Nyssa and Peri at the same time. There's then 1/4 of an hour of running around the EastEnders set, which is littered with random monsters that they've got out of storage, though not a Dalek. They had one on set, but Nation wouldn't give them the rights to use it. There's a cliffhanger where viewers could vote on whether the Doctor is saved by Mandy or Ron, 2 EastEnders characters. They voted for Mandy.
Leave her alone!
The companion is captured and uploaded to the Rani's mind thing, but they were Romana at the time, a Time Lord, not a human. They forgot to explain the significance of this, so had McCoy overdub it.
It'll overload.
The one benefit is the Brigadier got to finally meet the 6th Doctor, meaning he had on-screen meetings with all classic Doctors, and yeah, there's nothing really else to benefit from this. Tom Baker was still not wanting to return to the role, so he only filmed a brief opening where he gives this weird message.
She even hates children.
And insisted that he have a question mark branded on his face just to be difficult. They did the best they could at hiding this. For a show that was trying to rebuild its reputation, 13 million people watching this incoherent mess of an episode really didn't help matters. While not listed as a proper episode, it was included in the Doctor Who magazine 1997 poll, where it came dead last with a pitiful 30%. It's never been released on home video because the rights are owned by Children in Need, demanding £3,000 per minute, coming to a total of £52,000 for the rights. We're likely never getting this released, so if you want to watch it, it's on YouTube. It's worth noting that this was the last contribution director and co-writer John Nathan Turner ever made to Doctor Who. He died in 2002 of liver failure. He was only 54. There were, fortunately, other celebrations of the 30th anniversary. While BBC Two had been doing some rebroadcasts, showing the original unaired pilot episode in August 1991, they started re-showing old episodes intermittently from January 1992, getting between 1.5 to 3.5 million viewers, through to May 1994, by which point it had dropped to around 1 million viewers. The first repeat, The Time Meddler, was preceded by a documentary, Resistance is Useless, which was essentially a clips compilation with interludes by a talking anorak.
But not many people know why this Type 40 TARDIS, which the Doctor stole from the Time Lords, is shaped like a police telephone box. Well, that's due to a malfunction of the chameleon circuit, which allows it to take a shape to blend in with its surroundings.
Yeah, it's a very cheap and cobbled together production. But in November 1993, BBC One showed all 6 parts of the Planet of the Daleks, as well as shorts leading into them, mostly documentaries, most notably Missing in Action, about the missing episodes, but also the unit recruitment film.
Unite with UNIT and save the world.
But the biggest feature of the 30th anniversary was the documentary 30 Years in the TARDIS, or More Than 30 Years in the TARDIS, as it was released extended on VHS. This 90-minute documentary featured interviews with all sorts of people who worked on the show and celebrity fans.
Well, of course, I have made a lot of children's programmes, things like Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet, Joe 90 and so forth. But the real tragedy of my life is that my son, Jamie, is
a Doctor Who fan.
Yes.
While it was more focused on the 60s and 70s than the 80s, probably because the 80s was still quite recent, it's a touching and impassioned tribute to the show, showing the love that there still was for it. On top of all the interviews and teaching trivia about the show, it's full of archive material that just shows the nostalgia and how integrated into our lives the show was. What it's remembered for, however, are the brief recreations of classic moments throughout. We see a boy running home from school, imagining he's fighting the monsters from the show, and then he gets home and hides behind the sofa as the iconic theme plays on the TV. This is a beautiful portrait of the childhood wonder Doctor Who have brought into our lives for 3 decades, and at the end is a heart-wrenching moment as the music swells and the child steps into the awe-inspiring TARDIS. The inspiration will always be there. At the end of the credits, Alan Yentob gives a brief interview where he uses the House of Cards quote to tell us that there is hope on the horizon.
You may well think that, but I couldn't possibly comment.
The success of Doctor Who on video wasn't just exploited by the BBC. There were 2 companies that made licensed video spin-offs. Reeltime Pictures, founded by Keith Barnfather, had made their first production, Wartime, in 1988. After this, they mainly made documentaries. Who on Earth is Tom Baker featured Tom Baker interviewing himself as he talked about his life and his philosophy.
I'm sorry to bother you. Could you tell me where Tom Baker lives? He's an actor. He used to be an actor. He was very famous years ago. He was in a big series. He's dead. He died in agony in a basement flat in Clapham. Yeah, absolutely penniless. Always drunk he was. Nobody came to his funeral, you know.
Then was Return to Devil's End, which saw the cast and crew of the Daemons return to Elborn to discuss the making of what was at the time considered to be the greatest episode in the fan wisdom. They also produced a series of interviews called The Mythmakers, which they still make to this day and have produced over 150. These documentaries were largely the work of a man by the name of Nick Briggs. With financing from Dreamwatch, a magazine about sci-fi and fantasy programs, they returned to producing drama with Shakedown, Return of the Sontarans in 1994. Filmed on a World War II cruiser, giving a very industrial feel to the spaceship setting, and with music by McCoy-era composer Mark Ayers, this is rather a reined-back production, but what effects it does have are well done, with the virtual reality sailing being an interesting scene.
Mainsail inclination. Elevate 5 degrees.
Starring Sophie Aldred, Carol Ann Ford, Michael Wisher, and Blake Sevens, Brian Croucher, and Jan Chappell, this production couldn't feature or even name any Doctor Who characters.
I met this old boy once on Meteorologist 3. He called himself the physician or the dentist or something. He seemed to know a lot about Sontarans.
But what it does feature is the only on-screen meeting between the Sontarans and the Routons. Written by Terence Dix, the characters feel well explored despite its 1-hour runtime. The self-made millionaire and the resourceful captain survive, while the heirs and stuck-up fashionista die. The crew is infiltrated by a shape-shifting Routon, and the ship is boarded by Sontarans. Redesigned to this bonier yellow design with striking red uniforms, they somehow managed to give them a great design in spite of their limitations. Certainly the best they've looked since the Time Warrior. Even the Sontarans have fleshed out characters in this.
To find an engineer? It's a wild guess, Lieutenant, but maybe you could start with the engine room.
But they too are ultimately killed, as is the Routon. While it's only ever been released on VHS, this is actually a pretty good spin-off considering its restraints, and Dix novelised it to feature the 7th Doctor in the Virgin New Adventures. In the following year, in 1995, Reeltime were financed by Ian Levine to produce a sequel to The Abominable Snowmen and The Web of Fear. Written by Ghostlight and VNA writer Mark Platt, and directed by the legendary Christopher Barry, this told of the great intelligence infecting the minds of the youth through computers at a university set up by the still slightly possessed Victoria Waterfield.
I think I'm going to scream.
It features Deborah Watling, Jack Watling, Nicholas Courtney and Elizabeth Sladen back in their roles from the show. Given the amount of Who alumni involved in the production, it's difficult to justify discounting it, and at 70 minutes long, it's practically feature length. Supposed to be set in the late 90s, the design of the brainwashed movement, the Chili's, is dated to say the least. It's more ambitious than Shakedown, and as a result feels that bit cheaper. It most definitely is a straight-to-video production. There are some oddities in it, like this guy Daniel who seems to be absorbed by the great intelligence but can communicate with the Brigadier in his dreams and then gets turned into a Yeti? And Sarah Jane just sort of does her own thing and doesn't really contribute until the very end. But one interesting aspect is the introduction of the Brigadier's daughter, Kate Lethbridge-Stewart, played by Beverly Cressman. Officially, this isn't the same as Kate Stewart, who'd be played by Gemma Redgrave in the 2010s and 20s, but I mean, come on. What doesn't return is her son, Gordon, the Brigadier's grandson. Overall, it's an okay episode. A bit of a fangasm with all its returning characters and being a sequel to a 25-year-old missing story, but it's an interesting glimpse into what Doctor Who could have looked like in the early to mid-90s. The other company making Doctor Who licensed productions in the 90s was BBV, which stood for Bill and Ben Video, though was purposefully named to be confused with BBC Video, the first sign of troubles to come. Owned by Bill Baggs, he produced and directed most of the productions by the company. First they made The Stranger, which wasn't Doctor Who, but the idea was that you just change Stranger to Doctor and imagine the TARDIS is there around the corner, and well, you're there. The Stranger was played by Colin Baker, with his companion played by Nicola Bryant as Not Perry.
A chap called Bill Baggs, who is going to do extremely well in the world of television, because he's had the sense to employ me, had the idea of doing some stories about a character called The Stranger, played by me. And I look like the Sixth Doctor. Strange world, isn't it?
The first, Summoned by Shadows in 1991, was written by Christian Darkin, and is a pretty simple story in its 35 minutes, simply of a guy brainwashing people to search for parts of his crashed ship to repair himself. While it's certainly Doctor Who on a micro budget, what's interesting is the mobility of being made in simple video, allowing for more free cinematography than the show, though it is still incredibly cheap at some points.
Summoned by Shadows, which was a very interesting concept and done on a low budget but with very high production values, I thought. And it was a project which I was able to enter into wholeheartedly and am fairly proud of.
The second, More Than a Messiah by Nigel Fares, is a bit less imaginative, seeing the Doctor, Stranger, shack up with Sophie Aldred in a cave who's sort of the spirit of the planet and feels the pain being inflicted on it by this unhinged guy Not Perry's got tangled up with. And hey, at least there's an environmentalist message.
Touch. Feel. Until. Disturbed.
Straight and narrow lines.
Destroyed.
Unnatural.
Unwanted.
Voice unheeded.
Crying.
All of the Stranger videos after this were written by Nick Briggs, starting with In Memory Alone. The Stranger and Not Perry find themselves on a train station in the void with a hologram played by Nick Briggs in a bowler hat. The budget is clearly higher with this one, with more special effects which of course have aged more poorly. What's interesting about this is how it's a very conceptual story, giving us something that probably wouldn't have been attempted on the show.
No!
This followed directly into The Terror Game. This is where the series deviates from being a knockoff of Doctor Who. Finding himself on Earth without Nicola Bryant having left the series, in this episode the Stranger gets his memories back. He is a member of a terrorist cell called Solomon, who was tasked to assassinate a guy living in a nightclub along with Louise Jameson. His fellow terrorists are played by David Troughton, Patrick Sun, and John Wadmore, who have this portable laptop that connects them to the web.
Bastard! You set us up! There's a protectorate portal in the office. Under our noses?
Yes, we'll have to do the job now.
Later in 1994 was the continuation, Breach of the Peace, where the other two are posing as police officers to police played by Caroline John and Nick Briggs in the Moustache, as they search for Solomon. This is a very contemporary story, and viewed in isolation you wouldn't even realise it's a sci-fi, more of a police drama. At the end, the trio disappear into the next instalment, Eye of the Beholder. They find themselves on the farm where a girl, Meta, is being used for psychic experiments by the military. This 85-minute episode was double the length of any of the others and was the final instalment of The Stranger in 1995. Like much of this series, this more action-filled instalment does drag, and by this point you could say that the series had run its course. While the quality of the special effects, performances and stories varied wildly, though never really being great, The Stranger showed some great ambition and imagination, and was a pretty good effort for its tiny budget, though its place in canon, even if it weren't for the latter stories, would never have got it placed on the shelf alongside Doctor Who. Off the presumably success of that came the Airzone Solution in 1993.
We had Colin Baker, and with Colin's help I managed to coerce Peter Davison. I'd worked with Sophie Aldred on More Than a Messiah, and she helped me coerce Sylvester. And I get a phone call, we're actually on the set, and it was Jon Pertwee. John said to me, "I hear you're making a Doctor Who film, and why am I not in it?"
It also featured future award-winning actor and fan Alan Cumming and Nick Briggs in the beard. Unrelated to both The Stranger and Doctor Who, it is still inherently attached to both and sometimes erroneously listed as an episode of The Stranger. Described as being an ecological thriller, as the atmosphere is becoming toxic and people have to wear masks, the government signs Airzone to find a solution. But after an investigative reporter dies searching the facility, a weatherman gets visions of him and starts to uncover the truth.
Now you've probably spotted that this year's is bigger. In fact, it's 11% bigger.
Discovering that their plan is to adapt people to the new atmosphere.
Radical solutions are required to improve our lives in a rapidly changing environment. But we're not going to turn the world upside down as some pressure groups would have us do. We're not going to cause economic collapse so that the government has to wade in with budget-breaking handouts and market control. Together we will cross new frontiers of technology and human experience. Together we can breathe new life into our future.
For what it is, it's a pretty good production, frankly at the quality of some TV shows, and makes for a good drama, though it is noticeably less of a sci-fi than its related shows, and is more of a contemporary mystery piece, but nonetheless shows BBV's competency and promise. While none of these were officially Doctor Who related, operating outside of copyright, so never being able to even hint at being connected only in the minds of those who know, their first official licensed production came when they got the rights to Liz Shaw. Yeah, this would start the first ever spin-off series from Doctor Who, P.R.O.B.E. The first in the series was The Zero Imperative, released in August 1994. It saw Caroline John return as Liz Shaw, now working for the Preternatural Research Bureau, or P.R.O.B.E., along with Louise Jameson playing Patsy, her boss, with a relationship that may be more than professional. Other Who alumni who returned included brief appearances by Sylvester McCoy, Sophie Aldred, and Peter Davison in a cliffhanger twist at the end that isn't brought up again in subsequent episodes. Colin Baker plays Peter Russell, who's buying a mental institution, the Hawthorne Institute, formerly owned by David O'Kane, played by Jon Pertwee. There are several murders, including a character played by Mark Gatiss, the writer of all 4 episodes, who you may remember from Nightshade. In the end, it turns out that Patient Zero is Peter Russell's father, and there's some mystic force in him causing these murders at the hands of Peter. Patient Zero saves Liz at the cost of his own life, and the mystery is solved. The production was clearly filmed on location in this quite bare renovated estate building. While it may be cheap, it does give an authentic sense to this being set in an underfunded mental hospital. The next P.R.O.B.E video was The Devil of Winterbourne. Again written by Mark Gatiss and directed by Bill Baggs, Gatiss again has a role of George, a mentally handicapped caretaker that hasn't aged well. As well as Geoffrey Beevers as Rutherford, the head of P.R.O.B.E who's always down Liz's neck, and Terry Molly as a police detective, and of course Peter Davison as the school head teacher. The leads in this are played by Gatiss's friend and fellow fan Rhys Shearsmith, who would work together a lot in the future, and Daniel Matthews as Christian. There are mysterious goings-on at the school, including the sacrificial killing of a dog and a murder. Across the 80-minute mystery, which is certainly the best of the P.R.O.B.E videos, verging into psychological thriller, we discover that Christian believes himself to be the reincarnation of the school's founder, Isaac Greatorex, who was into witchcraft, a superstition kept going by the head teacher, essentially for fun. With gay undertones, showing the first same-sex kiss in Doctor Who canon, Christian kidnaps his schoolmate, who he clearly fancies, and plans to sacrifice him. He's caught at the last moment, but manages to jump into the motorway, mysteriously disappearing. Maybe there was some truth to his beliefs. The third in the series, Unnatural Selection, was released in January 1996. It again featured an investigation into mysterious goings-on and murders at a scientific institute called Beagle. Mark Gatiss again stars, this time as the goateed villain. We discover that he was the result of a scientific experiment and is harvesting people for their organs. This one is more into the science fiction than the supernatural or preternatural of the other videos. It's rather gory, with some of the dissections that make you squirm. This one is the horror piece of the lot. Though it's only 40 minutes long, it's probably the one that has the least to it and is the weakest of the four. The final of the P.R.O.B.E videos was also released in 1996, Ghosts of Winterbourne. As the name suggests, it's a sequel to The Devil of Winterbourne, as Andrew starts having visions of Christian, and after being taunted by other students for what he went through, he kills one of them. With the help of the now imprisoned head teacher, they hold a seance to banish the spirit of Greatorex. Weirdly, this installment was for years the only piece of Doctor Who media to have an 18 rating. That was until it was released on DVD and got demoted to a 12, so who knows why it was rated so high. It's pretty much just an epilogue to The Devil of Winterbourne, not really adding much other than seeing more of Shearsmith and Davison's characters and how they've been affected. That would be the last of the P.R.O.B.E series, at least for now, with Mark Gatiss moving on to better things and Baggs moving on to new productions in the late 90s. While they were cheap productions, they had their charm and were one of the ways that the show had been kept alive. It wouldn't be long before BBC Audio would also get in on the game. After the success of releasing missing episode audios on cassettes with linking narration, the BBC started doing original audio plays. In 1993 they released The Paradise of Death, a third Doctor story with Sarah and the Brigadier, and a new companion, Jamie Fitzoliver, played by Richard Pearce, who's a friend of Sarah's, set between the Time Warrior and Invasion of the Dinosaurs. It tells of an amusement park with creatures that have been teleported in from outer space. The Doctor investigates and is whisked away to an alien world where they meet its president and discover that he's being lied to about the goings-on of this world and, yeah. It's a pretty confused story and isn't exactly highly regarded. However, they would make a second audio with the third Doctor, Sarah, Brigadier and Jeremy in 1996, The Ghosts of N-Space. Adapted from the Virgin Missing Adventure, for some reason it uses the Fifth Doctor's theme. N-Space is a fourth-dimensional null space where spirits of the dead and demon-like beings exist.
Here we go then.
Look! There's a sort of glow over there above the stones. There she is! That's who I saw! Oh, I can't bear it!
No, Sarah! Stay here!
Look at the light, it's like frozen lightning!
You're seeing the cracks in the N-space barrier.
Oh my God!
Oh. Think again! But there's the one I saw before with a tentacle!
After seeing ghosts in Italy, the Doctor and Sarah travel back to the 15th century and encounter a monk who's wanting to harness the powers of N-space to become immortal, but gets trapped in a wall. Also, the brig seems to get into trouble with the Mafia. There are some interesting scenes of the Doctor and Sarah becoming ghosts and visiting N-space, but overall this is a more refined story than Paradise of Death, even with its time jumping. There were plans to do other audios with the Third Doctor, but these were cut short. Throughout the early 90s, Jon Pertwee had pretty much been seen as the Doctor, appearing wherever he could.
I think I need to see the Doctor.
In 1996 he had a back operation, but that didn't let him down. He then appeared in a fan film, Devious, set after the War Games in the fabled Season 6B and starring Tony Garner as a forgotten Doctor, who really does seem like halfway between Troughton and Pertwee. Pertwee thought he was turning up to a small fan convention, but was instead asked to film the ending regeneration scene of Garner becoming him, and was more than happy to take part. This would be Jon Pertwee's last appearance as the Doctor. 2 weeks later, on the 20th of May 1996, he died of a heart attack in his sleep.
He'll be very sadly missed. He was a great man. I mean, I can definitely say that I was in the company of a great man, and he made me laugh so much.
As this was his final appearance, this fan film holds a special regard, and was even included on the DVD of the War Games. The final entry in this era of Doctor Who comes in the form of a real-time documentary, I Was a Doctor Who Monster. An interesting documentary interviewing many of the people who performed as the monsters on the show, though the recreations are a bit lacking.
OK, so there will be a picture behind me, is that right?
I know you can't see it, but trust me, it'll be groovy.
It talks about how the monsters were achieved and their memories working on them. But what stands out is the ending scene.
And maybe, and let's hope so, it may even continue for another 25, 30 years, who knows?
While there have been all these attempts to keep Doctor Who running through comics and novels and videos and audios, there have been rumblings in the background of something big to come.
The stories of Doctor Who. And the series was made for 26 years by the BBC. But in 1989, at the end of survival, it looked as if Doctor Who was finished for good. But at the time of making this video, things are looking brighter. And a new TV movie has actually been made, with a little help from yours truly.
Doctor Who would return.
Doctor Who is back in one of the hottest computer games of the year. It's super arcade adventure all the way as you battle your way through 5 huge levels. Mutilate mutants, menace monsters, and exterminate those evil Daleks before they exterminate you. Dalek Attack, the meanest game this side of Skaro.